The day Ralph Prescott rode back into Caldwell, Kansas, the summer of 1889 was already burning the earth to a pale, cracked gold, and Pauline Chandler stood at the window of her farmhouse and watched the dust rise from the road like smoke from an old fire she had never quite managed to put out. She recognized him before she could see his face. She recognized the way he sat a horse straight-backed but easy, the way a man sits who has spent more years in the saddle than out of it, the brim of his hat tilted just enough against the afternoon sun. She recognized the roan mare, older now, her dark coat faded at the flanks, and she recognized the quiet deliberateness of his pace, the way he did not rush toward anything but moved as if the world owed him no particular hurry. 10 years. 10 years since she had last seen Ralph Prescott, and in that decade she had buried a husband, raised a son, planted and harvested and replanted this land until her hands told the story of every season that had passed. She had kept her silence through all of it, through the grief, through the whispered speculation in town, through the long winter nights when the truth sat inside her chest like a stone she could not swallow and could not cough up. She had kept quiet because she had believed, truly believed, that silence was the kindest thing she could offer. But watching Ralph come down that road, watching him return as if something had called him back from wherever the wide country had swallowed him, she understood with a clarity that surprised her that the time for silence was done. She let the curtain fall back into place and pressed her palm flat against her sternum, steadying herself. Her son, Daniel, was 9 years old and currently occupied with something involving the old barn cat and a length of rope that Pauline had decided not to investigate. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the soft breathing of the afternoon wind through the screen she had put up herself 2 springs past. She smoothed her apron, tucked a loose strand of dark hair back from her face, and moved toward the door. She stepped onto the porch just as Ralph reached the edge of her property, and he pulled the roan to a stop and looked at her from under the brim of that dusty hat, and for a long moment neither of them said a word. He was older naturally. The lines at the corners of his eyes had deepened, and there was more weathering in the planes of his face than there had been at 32, which was how old he had been when he left. His jaw carried a short beard, which he had not had before, and his brown eyes, which she remembered as being quick and often full of something that looked like held-back laughter, were steadier now, more settled, the way a man's eyes become when he has seen enough of the world that he is no longer surprised by most of it. He was still lean but broader through the shoulders. The years had not been unkind to him, they had simply been honest. "Pauline," he said. His voice was lower than she remembered, and it landed on her name the way a hand lands on a piano key, deliberate, resonant, producing something she felt in her ribs. "Ralph Prescott," she said, "I saw the dust from the road. You always did ride like you owned whatever ground you were crossing." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one like a door opening just an inch. "I heard about Marcus," he said. "I'm sorry. I heard a while back, but I was far out, Wyoming, then up toward Montana for a stretch. It took me a long time to work my way back." "It's been nearly 3 years since Marcus passed," she said. Her voice was even. She had made her peace with Marcus Chandler's death in ways that were more complicated than grief alone allowed for, but she had made it. "I know," Ralph said. "I should have come sooner." He paused, and the mare shifted beneath him, flicking her tail at a fly. "The truth is, Pauline, I wasn't sure you'd want to see me. After everything." "After everything," she repeated quietly. She studied him for a moment. The afternoon light was falling long and golden across the yard, catching the dust on his coat, illuminating the worn leather of his saddlebags. "You'd better come in," she said. "There are things I need to tell you, things I should have told you a long time ago." He swung down from the mare with the practiced ease of a man born to it, and tied her loosely to the post at the yard gate. And Pauline went inside to put the coffee on, her heart beating harder than she wanted to admit. The kitchen was the warmest room in the farmhouse, which was saying something given the Kansas summer, But it was also the room where Pauline felt most herself. The cast-iron stove she had learned to coax and manage over a decade alone, the scrubbed pine table where Daniel did his arithmetic, and she kneaded bread on Sunday mornings, the smell of dried herbs she kept hanging near the window, lavender and sage and a little rosemary, because she liked the smell of it even if it served no great practical purpose. She poured water into the pot and set it to heat, and she heard Ralph's boots on the porch boards and then the screen door opening and the particular sound of a man making himself respectfully small in a space that belongs to someone else. He took his hat off when he came inside. He had always done that. She had remembered it without knowing she was remembering it. "Sit down," she said, without turning from the stove. "You look like you've been riding since before sunrise." "Since about 4 this morning," he confirmed, and she heard the creak of the chair as he settled into it. "Came from the Denton place. Old Henry Denton took me on for the spring drive, and when the season ended I found I couldn't make myself go anywhere else." "Anywhere else," she said. "You mean back here?" "I mean back here," he agreed. She turned then and looked at him sitting at her kitchen table with his hat on his knee and his brown eyes watching her with that particular steadiness he had acquired, and she felt the full weight of 10 years pressed down on her all at once, not unpleasantly. More the way a long-held breath releases, not comfortable exactly, but necessary. "I'll tell you everything," she said. "All of it. I promised myself I would the moment I saw you coming down the road, and I intend to keep that promise. But I want the coffee first, and I want you to eat something, because you look like the territory's been taking more from you than it's been giving, and I want you to be sitting down proper when you hear what I have to say." He looked at her with something that might have been wonder mixed into that steadiness. "All right," he said. "I'll wait." She put biscuits on from a batch she had made that morning, and she fried 2 eggs because she had them, and she set the coffee down strong and black because she remembered he took it that way, and the memory was simply there, available, like a book she had not put back on the shelf. He ate without rushing, and she sat across from him with her own cup and watched the dust settle outside the window and thought about where to begin. Daniel came in through the back door trailing the barn cat, who looked deeply unimpressed with whatever adventure had just concluded, and he stopped at the sight of a stranger at the table and regarded Ralph with the frank, unsentimental assessment that only 9-year-old boys and old ranch dogs can pull off without giving offense. "This is Mr. Prescott," Pauline said. "He's an old friend. Ralph, this is my son Daniel." Ralph looked at the boy, really looked, the way he looked at everything, steady and unhurried, and then he extended his hand across the table. "Pleased to meet you, Daniel." Daniel shook it with reasonable solemnity. "Are you a cowboy?" he asked. "I have been on occasion," Ralph said. "Do you have a gun?" "Daniel," Pauline said. "Yes," Ralph said, "I do. It's in the saddlebag on my horse. I don't carry it in people's houses." Daniel absorbed this information as if it confirmed something he had already suspected about the nature of reasonable men. "Okay," he said, and went to find himself a biscuit, apparently satisfied. After they had eaten and Daniel had been sent to finish his chores with the kind of firm maternal authority that left no room for negotiation, Pauline poured fresh coffee and folded her hands on the table and looked at Ralph Prescott and began to talk. "You have to understand," she said, "that when Marcus came to me in the summer of 1878 and asked me to marry him, I was 20 years old and I had very few options. My father had just died. The farm was mortgaged. Marcus was established. He had land, and he was not unkind, not then, not for the first couple of years. He was not what I would have chosen if I had been free to choose freely. But I was not, and so I chose what I could." Ralph was listening with his whole body still, the coffee cup cradled in both hands. "You came to Caldwell in the spring of 1879, Pauline continued. "You were working the cattle trail for the Carmichael outfit, bringing longhorns up from Texas, and you stayed on for the season because the Carmichael foreman said the herd needed managing before the next drive, and you were the best man he had for it. You remember all that." "I remember," Ralph said quietly. And you and Marcus became friendly, in the way men who work cattle together become friendly. And Marcus invited you to supper, and you came, and we talked, the three of us. And then you came again the following week, and then the week after that. And by the time summer turned to fall, you were coming to supper most every Friday, and Marcus was always pleased to see you, and she stopped. She looked at her hands. And I was something more than pleased, but I never said so. I never acted on it, not once, not even close. I want you to understand that before I say anything else. Whatever I felt, I kept it where it belonged, which was inside, and I was a faithful wife to my husband. Whatever came after, I was that. I never doubted it, Ralph said, and his voice was low and careful, and she could hear something in it that she chose not to examine too closely just yet. That fall, she said, October of 1879, two things happened. The first thing was that I realized I had fallen well and truly in love with you. The second thing was that you told him at supper one Friday night, before I had put the apple cake on the table, that you were leaving, that you were riding out in the morning, heading west. You had a stake in a cattle operation out in New Mexico territory, and you were going. You shook Marcus's hand and you looked at me, and you said it had been the finest stretch of months you could remember, and you wished us both well. Ralph set his coffee cup down. He said nothing. You left the next morning, Pauline said. And I watched you ride away from the kitchen window, the same way I watched you ride in today. And I said nothing. And I did not say anything because there was nothing to say. You were going, I was married, and that was the shape of things. I made my peace with it. She paused. Or I tried. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, somewhere beyond the yard, Daniel was making some kind of noise that suggested the barn cat had been relocated from wherever Daniel had put it and was registering its objection. But here is what I did not tell you, Pauline said. And here her voice changed, not much, just a fraction, just enough that Ralph straightened almost imperceptibly in his chair. And here is what I have kept quiet about for 10 years, because I did not know how to say it, and because the saying of it would have changed things in ways I could not fully predict, and because, if I am being honest, which I intend to be, I was afraid. Tell me, Ralph said. It was 2 words simply spoken, and they carried the weight of 10 years in them. Marcus knew, she said. Not about my feelings, I don't believe he ever fully understood those, but he knew something else. He knew that on the last night you came to supper, you did not speak to him only about your plans in New Mexico. You spoke to him about this farm, about the mortgage, about the fact that the Caldwell Cattlemen's Association was organizing against men like Marcus, small operations, independent men who would not sell to the bigger interests, and that there was pressure coming, real pressure, the kind that can put a man off his land. She watched Ralph's face. You told him that, didn't you? You warned him. Ralph's jaw tightened. I did, he said. And what you did not know, Pauline said, was that Marcus went to the association the very next day. He went to Benjamin Crowther, who was the head of it then, before he died of a stroke in '83, and he told Benjamin that you had warned him, that you had said the association was planning to push out the small operators, and Crowther sent a man after you. The silence in the kitchen was sudden and absolute. Ralph was very still. A man, he said slowly. A man named Cole Whitfield, Pauline said. I did not know about Whitfield at the time. I did not find out for 3 years, not until 1882, when Marcus was drinking more than he should have been, which he started doing after the association lost its hold on the county following the disputes of '81. He told me one night when the whiskey had gotten further into him than it usually did. He told me that he had reported you to Crowther, and that Crowther had sent Whitfield west to find you and warn you off, warn you with more than words, was how Marcus put it. She watched the color in Ralph's face and what it was doing. Did Whitfield find you? Ralph looked at the table for a long moment. Then he looked up at her, and there was something in his brown eyes now that had not been there before, something old and complicated, the way a scar looks when you have mostly stopped noticing it and then someone mentions it. He found me, Ralph said, in the spring of 1880 outside of Santa Fe. He and two other men. They jumped me on the road coming back from the cattle pens. They broke two of my ribs and they put a knife across my left arm. He turned his forearm over on the table, and she could see the faded scar running pale along the inside of his wrist, and they told me that if I ever came back to Kansas, I would not ride out again. Pauline had known some version of this was coming, had known it from the moment Marcus told her about Whitfield, but hearing it from Ralph's own mouth, sitting here at her table in the Kansas afternoon, made it different. Made it real in a way it had not quite been before. She felt something clench in her chest. "I am sorry," she said. "I am so sorry, Ralph. I did not know, not until 1882, and by then you had been gone 3 years and I had no way of knowing where you were, and then Marcus," she stopped. "Then Marcus what?" Ralph asked. "Marcus made me promise," she said, and her voice was quieter now. "That last night when he told me about Whitfield, he made me promise not to speak of it to anyone. He said it was over and done and that Whitfield was dead. He had been shot in a card game in Denver the previous year, is what Marcus told me, and that there was no point in bringing it up. He said it would only cause trouble for him with whatever remained of his connections in the county, and he was not wrong about that. And I was still his wife. I still believed, even then, that I owed him something, that keeping his secrets was part of what a wife did." She shook her head slowly. "I have thought about that promise many times over the years. I have turned it over in my hands until I know every side of it, and I still cannot tell you with certainty whether I kept quiet for the right reasons or the wrong ones. What I can tell you is that I kept quiet, and that every year of the silence it became harder to imagine breaking it, until it felt less like a promise and more like a wall I had built around something I was not sure I had the right to touch." Ralph had not moved. He was looking at her with an expression she could not name precisely. It was not anger, though there may have been something related to it somewhere underneath, and it was not grief exactly, though it was adjacent to that. It was the expression of a man who has just been handed an explanation for something that has shaped 10 years of his life, and who is carefully, methodically, processing what that explanation means. "Marcus told Crowther," Ralph said finally. He said it with a kind of flat, measured weight, the way a man names a thing before he decides what he thinks about it. "Yes," Pauline said. "Because I warned him," Ralph said. "I warned him because I thought he deserved to know what was coming. I thought he was a decent man who was going to lose his land if no one told him the association was coming for it." He gave a short, dry exhale that was not quite a laugh. "I suppose there is something almost comic about that if you are inclined to look at it that way." "I am not so inclined," Pauline said. "No," he said. "Neither am I particularly." They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the light was changing, tilting from gold toward amber, and the air coming through the screen had cooled slightly. Pauline watched Ralph's face and let him have the time he needed. "Why did you stay with him?" Ralph asked. "After he told you about Whitfield, after you knew." It was the question she had been waiting for, and the one she had been asking herself for 7 years. "Because I had a child," she said simply. "Daniel was born in 1880. And I had this land which I had come to think of as mine in ways that had nothing to do with Marcus. And because, Ralph, I need to be honest with you, even about the parts that do not flatter me. After 1882, after Marcus told me what he had done, something changed between us. It was not that I hated him. I did not quite. It was more that whatever had been keeping us together as something more than simply two people sharing a house began to come apart slowly, like a seam that has been under too much strain for too long. We lived together respectfully enough. He was a decent father to Daniel, I will give him that. But we were not what a marriage is supposed to be, for the last 5 or 6 years of it. And when he died, in the spring of 1886, of the lung infection that took him at the end of March, I grieved for what we had not been able to be to each other. And I kept his secret because he was dead and there was nothing to be gained by unearthing it, and because I did not know where you were or how to reach you, and because," she stopped herself and looked at her hands on the table, "because, Ralph said gently, because saying it out loud would have meant admitting the full scope of what I had kept inside for so long, she said, and I was not sure I was ready for that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "But you are now." "You came back," she said simply. "I saw you on that road, and I understood that if I let you ride past without saying it, I would be keeping the silence for the rest of my life. And I am done keeping it." The clock on the mantel marked the half-hour with a soft chime. Daniel's voice floated in from somewhere near the barn, carrying on some private conversation with the cat that Pauline decided she was grateful for, because it meant the boy was occupied and she and Ralph could have this moment without interruption. Ralph reached across the table and set his hand over hers. Not asking anything, not pressing, simply placing it there, the way you set something down that has been too heavy to carry for too long. His hand was rough and large and warm and real, and Pauline felt something break open in her chest, not painfully, not like breaking glass, more like the way frozen ground breaks open in spring, a yielding, a giving way, a release. "I am sorry," he said. "For what Marcus did, for what Whitfield did to me on that road. I should be clear, that is not your fault, and it never was, not for a single minute of it. I am not angry with you, Pauline. I want to make sure you understand that." "I am angry with myself," she said. "Enough for both of us." "Don't be," he said, and his thumb moved once across her knuckles, a light and careful motion. "You were 21 years old, married, with a child coming. You were trying to survive. A person can only do so much with the choices that are in front of them. I could have written to you," she said. "After 1882, I could have found a way." "You didn't know where I was," he said. "I could have tried." "Maybe," he said, "but we are here now. I am here now." She turned her hand over so that his palm was resting in hers, and she looked at him, really looked, the way you look at someone when you are done pretending you are not looking. He was 42 years old, and he had spent those years the way the land spent them, worked over, shaped by weather and labor and time, honest in every visible mark on him. And there was something else she saw in him, something she had seen at 20 and had never quite stopped seeing, even in the years when it lived only in the private chamber of her own memory. A fundamental decency, a quality of being present with another person that was rare and that she had always recognized, and that she recognized now as plainly as she recognized the smell of her own kitchen. "Why did you come back?" she asked. "Truly. You said you could not make yourself go anywhere else, but that is not the whole of it." He looked at her, and the door that had been a fraction open before opened a little more. "You know why," he said. "I want to hear you say it." "Because I have loved you since the summer of 1879, he said, and his voice was plain and unhurried and utterly certain, the way things are certain when they have been true for a long time and you have finally stopped fighting them. "I left because I thought you were happy, and I thought you were where you wanted to be. And I thought my being in love with you was my problem to manage and not yours. And I went west and I stayed west and I worked the cattle country for 10 years and there was not a year of it when I did not think about you. And when I heard Marcus had died, I told myself it was still not my place, that too much time had passed, that you had your life and your son and your farm. And then I told myself I was being a coward, which I believe is accurate. So I came back, to see you, to ask." He stopped. He started again. "To ask whether any of what I felt was something you had ever felt yourself, or whether I had spent 10 years in love with a memory that only I was carrying." Pauline looked at him for a long time. The amber light lay across the table between them. The clock ticked. Somewhere outside, a meadowlark was calling its last call of the evening from wherever it had settled in the grass. "You were not carrying it alone," she said. He closed his eyes for just a moment. A single, long breath. When he opened them, she was still looking at him, and something in his expression had shifted from the careful steadiness he had been carrying since he rode in, shifted into something softer and less armored and altogether more alive. "Well," he said, and there was that suggestion of a smile, more defined now, finding its full shape. "That is very fine news, Pauline Chandler." She laughed, a real laugh, sudden and a little surprised by itself, the way laughter is when it has not been used in a while. "I suppose it is," she said. He stayed for supper that evening. And then, because the light was gone and Caldwell was 6 miles by road, and the nearest decent boarding house was old Mrs. Hatch's establishment on the main street, which was frankly not worth what she charged for it, Pauline put blankets on the spare cot in the small room off the kitchen that had once been used for storage, and told him he could sleep there if he was comfortable with that arrangement. He said he had slept on harder ground than any cot she could offer, and he was grateful, and she heard the simple gratitude in it without it carrying any other weight. And she went to bed that night in her own room and lay awake listening to the house breathe around her and feeling, for the first time in a very long time, as though the future was a place she was actually looking forward to entering. In the morning he was up before she was, which she discovered when she came into the kitchen and found the coffee already made and Ralph standing at the back door looking out at the gray-rose sky of early sunrise. He had his hat in his hand, and he had clearly been up for some time. "You did not have to do that," she said, nodding toward the coffee pot. "I know," he said. "I wanted to do something useful." He turned from the door. "I was also thinking." "What about?" "About whether you would object to me helping with some of the work around the place today, before I go." He said the last part carefully, as though he were not certain what going meant or whether it was the right direction. "I do not object," she said, pouring her cup. "The fence along the south pasture wants mending. I have been meaning to get to it for 2 weeks and something always comes up." "I can do a fence," he said. "I know you can." And so began what would become, quietly and without any formal announcement, a new shape to the days. He mended the fence that first day. He did it well, properly, methodically, with the careful attention to detail that marked everything he did with his hands. Daniel came out mid-morning and watched him work for a while, and Ralph explained what he was doing in the matter-of-fact way that a certain kind of man explains things to boys, treating them as sensible people who can understand sensible information. And Daniel absorbed it with intense 9-year-old concentration, and asked several questions that Ralph answered without condescension. And by lunchtime, Daniel had decided that Ralph Prescott was probably all right. Pauline watched this from the garden where she was pulling weeds, and she felt something warm and complicated move through her that she recognized as hope, that fragile and determined emotion she had been so careful with for so long. He did not stay. At the end of the day, as the sun went down and the cooling air came off the prairie, he put his tools back where he had found them and washed his face and hands at the pump and came to the porch where Pauline was sitting, and he stood with one boot on the bottom step and his hat in his hand, and he said, "I should go into town, get a room, give you your house back." "You are not imposing," she said. "I know," he said. "But there are people in Caldwell who will talk if they have something to talk about, and I do not want to give them anything at your expense." She appreciated this. She appreciated it quite specifically, the fact that his first concern was her reputation, her place in this community that was hers in ways that depended partly on what people thought of her. She had lived here for 15 years and she intended to go on living here, and he understood that without her having to explain it. "Come for supper tomorrow," she said, "if you want to." He looked at her and the smile was there, easy and warm. "I want to," he said. He came for supper the next evening, and the evening after that, and before the week was out, he had established a rhythm that Pauline found she organized her days around without noticing she was doing it. The way you organize your days around something that has always made sense even if you have been without it for a long time. He was staying at Mrs. Hatch's, which was not cheap, and which Ralph bore with the stoic good humor of a man who had endured worse and was doing it for good reason. He came to the farm in the mornings and worked. There was always something that needed doing, and the farm had suffered from 3 years of a woman managing it alone following Marcus's death. Not because Pauline was incapable, which she decidedly was not, but because there are simply limits to what one person can do. He fixed the fence and rehung the barn door, and patched the leaking section of the roof over the chicken coop, and rebuilt the cold cellar shelves that had been rotting since the spring rains. He did these things without being asked, noting what needed doing with the quiet, practical attention of a man who likes work and understands land. In the evenings he stayed for supper, and afterward they sat on the porch in the long summer dusk and talked, the way people talk when they have been given back something they thought they had lost, not trying to cover everything at once, but settling into it, taking their time, letting each evening give what it could. He told her about the years in New Mexico territory, the cattle operation that had started promisingly and then been broken up by a drought in 1881, and the lingering violence of the period that the territory was still trying to come out from under. He told her about the years in Wyoming, working as a trail boss, and then briefly as a deputy sheriff in a small county that could not afford the lawman it needed but hired Ralph because he was steady, and because the previous deputy had shot himself in the foot literally, and departed for less demanding employment. He told her about the winter of 1886 and 1887, the great die-up, the brutal cold that killed cattle across the northern plains by the hundreds of thousands, and how he had spent that winter in a dugout shelter with 2 ranch hands and a Mexican drover named Esteban who played the guitar, and kept them all from losing their minds during the long blizzard stretches. She listened to all of it with the same quality of attention she gave everything full, honest, unperformed, and she told him her own years in return, the early years with Marcus when it had been hard but survivable, Daniel's birth in the summer of 1880, the happiest single day she could remember from that period, holding a red-faced and absolutely furious newborn and laughing through her tears because he was so clearly, so indignantly, alive. The years after 1882 and the slow erosion of her marriage, the farm and what it had taken from her and what it had given back. The year Marcus died and the long, strange months afterward when she had learned what it felt like to be solely responsible for a child and a piece of land with no one to share either the burden or the small, daily satisfactions of it. She did not idealize any of it. She told it straight, the way she had always preferred to do things, honestly, with her eyes open, not asking for pity and not offering false consolation, just the true shape of things as she had lived them. And Ralph listened with his whole self, and she understood, watching him listen, that this was perhaps the thing she had most missed and most wanted. Someone who was genuinely interested in who she was and what she had made of her time on this earth. Not someone who needed her or who depended on her or who saw her as a supporting player in his own story, but someone who found her interesting in the fullest sense, who wanted to know all of it, who was not waiting for her to finish so he could speak but was actually present in what she was saying, turning it over, asking questions, giving it the weight it deserved. It was Daniel who said something first, which made a certain kind of sense. Children tend to name things before adults have worked up the courage to. They were at supper on a Thursday evening in late July, 3 weeks after Ralph had ridden in, and Daniel was eating his beans with the single-minded intensity that marked his approach to most meals, and he looked up at Ralph and said, without any particular preamble, "Are you going to stay?" Ralph looked at the boy, and then at Pauline, and then back at the boy. "I am not sure yet," he said. "That is something your mother and I would need to talk about." "Because I think you should," Daniel said. "The fence got done and the barn door does not bang anymore and you show me how to do things." He returned to his beans. "But it is your choice." Pauline did not look at Ralph, focusing her attention on pouring more water, but she was smiling at her glass and she suspected he could see it. After Daniel was in bed, they sat on the porch in the particular softness of the summer night, the prairie breathing around them, the stars out in the full extravagance they display only on clear nights far from town, and neither of them spoke for a while, and the comfortable quality of the silence told Pauline something she had been telling herself for several days now. "He is right, you know," she said finally. Ralph turned his head to look at her. The lamplight from the window touched one side of his face and left the other in shadow. "I know he is," Ralph said, "but I want to do this properly," she said. I want Ralph. I have spent 15 years making choices out of necessity rather than out of what I actually wanted, and I do not want to do that again. I want to know what this is before I let it become what it might be. I want to be certain. What would certain look like? He asked. She thought about it honestly. Come to church with us on Sunday, she said. Come into town with me. Let people see you and let me see how we are when we are not just the two of us on this farm with the work between us. She paused. People will talk either way, but I want to understand what I am walking into. All right, he said. Sunday. He came on Sunday, and they walked to the small white church on Caldwell's Main Street. Pauline in her good blue dress with the white collar she had made herself, Daniel in his cleaned and ironed shirt that he had protested, and then accepted with the martyred air of a boy who understands that some battles are not worth fighting, and Ralph in a clean shirt and his best coat, which he had pressed at the laundry in town, and which was considerably better than what he usually wore, though he was clearly slightly uncomfortable in it. The congregation of the Caldwell Community Church was not large, perhaps 40 families, the kind of mixed, hard-working community that prairie towns produced, farmers and a few merchants, and the schoolteacher and old Judge Harlan who had presided over the local court since before most of his neighbors could remember. They were also, like most small congregations, extremely observant of anything new. Pauline felt the attention on them from the moment they walked in, felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure, and she held her head up and moved to her usual pew and let Daniel slide in first and sat down with Ralph beside her, as though this were the most natural arrangement in the world, which she was deciding it was. After the service, standing in the warm morning outside the church door while the congregation dispersed in small clusters of conversation, Pauline introduced Ralph to the people she knew well enough to introduce him to, which was most of them. She introduced him as an old friend come back to visit, which was accurate, and she watched the way he handled the introductions. Easy and warm but not overly familiar, respectful, making eye contact. The way a man carries himself when he has nothing to hide and a fundamental comfort in his own skin. Agnes Porter, who was 70 years old and the closest thing Caldwell had to a community historian, and who had opinions about everything and the longevity to express them fully, took Pauline's arm after most people had drifted away and pulled her aside with the fond authoritarianism of a woman who has earned that right through decades. "He's a good man," Agnes said, looking after Ralph, who was crouched down by the church steps in his good coat talking to Daniel about something, unself-conscious and completely present. "I can see it from here. I've been reading men for 70 years, Pauline, and a woman who cannot tell a good man from a bad one by 70 has not been paying attention." "No," Pauline agreed softly, watching him. "I think you are right." "Don't let being careful turn into being foolish," Agnes said, which was, Pauline acknowledged privately, about the most useful piece of advice she had received in years. The summer deepened and turned. August came in hard and dry, as Kansas Augusts do, the heat sitting on the land without apology, the creek behind the south pasture running lower, the sky most days a white blue that Pauline associated with the deep summer even now, after 15 years of them. The work of the farm was unrelenting in the way all farm work is, and Ralph worked beside her through it without complaint, and without making her feel as though his help was something she was supposed to be grateful for in a deferential way. He worked because the work needed doing, and because this land mattered to her, and because it was beginning to matter to him, and the distinction was important. There was an afternoon in the middle of August when they were working the garden together, Pauline staking the tomatoes that had grown taller than expected, Ralph turning the soil in the beds she wanted to replant in the fall, and a thunderstorm came up from the southwest with the sudden, enormous intensity that Kansas storms have, the sky going from flat white to rolling black in the space of 20 minutes, the first drops fat and purposeful, the smell of it arriving before the rain itself. They ran for the barn, both of them abandoning their tools and running across the yard as the sky opened up, and they made it through the barn door just ahead of the full force of it, and Ralph pulled the door shut behind them and turned and found Pauline laughing, the way she had been laughing more lately, freely, unguardedly, the laughter of a woman who is remembering what ease feels like. "I left the tomato steaks," she said. "The tomatoes will be fine," he said. He was damp across the shoulders, and she could see the water in his hair where his hat had not covered, and he was looking at her with that expression again, the one she had learned to read over these weeks, the careful and honest and certain love in it, and she felt it settle on her like the cool air the storm was bringing in, welcome, overdue, completely right. She took one step toward him. He stood still and let her take it, and she put her hand on the side of his face, his jaw rough under her palm, and he covered her hand with his, and she kissed him. It was a quiet kiss, not tentative exactly but careful, like a first step onto ice you are not quite sure will hold, and then it held and it deepened, and she felt his arms come around her, and the rain hammered the barn roof above them, and the thunder rolled across the prairie, and Pauline Chandler, at 31 years old, kissed Ralph Prescott in her barn in a Kansas thunderstorm and felt the last of the wall she had built come down. When they separated, she did not step back, and neither did he. They stayed close, his forehead touching hers, his hands warm on her back, and outside the rain poured straight and solid, and the lightning moved through the sky, and she could feel him breathing, and she could feel her own heart doing something exuberant and unruly that she suspected was going to take some getting used to. "I have wanted to do that since approximately the summer of 1879, he said, very quietly near her ear. "You had about 10 years on me," she said. He laughed, a real, full laugh, warm and genuine, and she felt it against her and thought she could listen to that sound for the rest of her life and never get tired of it. They stood in the barn while the storm moved over them and eventually past them, the rain easing from a roar to a murmur and then to the soft, steady sound of water dripping from the eaves. And they talked in the companionable way of people who have crossed into a new territory together and are orienting themselves with pleasure rather than anxiety. The horses shifted in their stalls. The barn smelled of hay and rain and the earthy warmth of animals, and the last of the afternoon light came through the barn boards in long pale lines and lay across the straw. When the rain had stopped and they went back into the yard, the garden was sparkling and the air had dropped 15 degrees and the sky to the east was a deep, washed blue, and Pauline looked at it and thought that she was happy. Not the careful, managed kind of content she had constructed for herself over the long years of doing without, but genuinely, weightlessly, fully happy, and the feeling was so complete and so unexpected that she stopped walking for a moment just to let it exist without doing anything with it. Ralph was beside her and he saw her stop and he looked at her face and he did not say anything, because he understood her well enough by now to know that she was not stopping because anything was wrong. He simply waited, and then he took her hand, and they walked back toward the house together in the new-washed evening. He asked her to marry him in September, which she had not expected so soon, and then upon reflection she had, because Ralph was not a man who did things halfway or left important things unspoken once he had decided they needed to be said. He did it properly. He came to supper on a Friday evening with his good coat on and his hat in his hand, and after Daniel had gone to bed, he stood up from the table, and she looked at him standing there in her kitchen looking simultaneously perfectly at ease and slightly more serious than his usual resting state, and she thought she knew what was coming before he said a word. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask it," she said. "I want to stay," he said, "not just visiting. Not just helping with the fence and the barn and whatever else wants doing. I want to stay on this land with you and Daniel, and I want to build a life here with you, if you will have me. I am 42 years old and I have spent enough of my life in motion to know what I want when I have stopped moving toward it. You are what I want. This is where I want to be." He paused. "Pauline Chandler, will you marry me?" She looked at him for a moment. She looked at him the way she had looked at him on that first day, standing at her window watching the dust rise on the road, except now she was not watching from a distance. Now she was standing inside it. "Yes," she said, "I will." He closed the space between them and put his arms around her, and held her the way you hold something you were afraid you had lost and are determined never to take for granted. And she held him back with equal conviction. They were married in October of 1889, in the same small white church on Caldwell's Main Street, on a Saturday afternoon when the cottonwoods along the creek had gone to gold, and the air had that particular clarity it takes on in the Kansas fall, sharp and clean, and full of the smell of turned earth and dying grass, and something that always made Pauline think of beginning, even when the season was ending. Agnes Porter sat in the front row and wept with the dignified composure of a woman who has earned the right to weep at happy occasions without explanation. Daniel stood at Ralph's side as the nearest thing to a best man that Ralph had in Caldwell, which he had accepted with a combination of pride and effort at solemnity that Pauline found almost unbearably endearing. The congregation filled the pews, and the afternoon light came through the church windows in long planes and lay gold across everything. And Pauline stood in her good cream-colored dress that she had made herself and looked at Ralph Prescott, and said the words she was saying with her full heart behind every syllable. Ralph repeated his words with the same steady certainty he brought to everything. No hesitation, no performance, no looking away, just the simple, absolute commitment of a man who knows what he is doing and has chosen it freely. He put the ring on her finger, a plain gold band that he had ordered from the jeweler in Wichita because Caldwell's was the wrong size, and she felt it settle onto her hand and felt it as something solid and real and hers. The reception was held in the church hall, which the women of the congregation had decorated with dried flowers and green boughs from the trees along the creek, and Mrs. Haverson had made a cake, and several other women had brought food, and there was music from Tom Briggs, who played the fiddle competently if not brilliantly, and who knew enough songs to keep the evening going, and people danced and talked and ate, and Pauline moved through all of it feeling as though she were living inside something she had only allowed herself to imagine from the outside for a very long time. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had gone and Daniel had fallen asleep on a bench in the corner with his good shirt still on and his shoes off, Ralph found Pauline standing by the window, looking out at the dark Main Street. He came and stood beside her, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him in the way she was learning she could lean, with all her weight if she needed to, and he would not tip. "Well," she said softly, "here we are." "Here we are," he said. He pressed a kiss to her hair. "How are you?" "Happy," she said, "properly happy, the kind that does not feel like it is going to break." He held her a little tighter. "Good," he said. "That is what it is supposed to feel like." She looked out at the dark street and the stars above it, and thought about the 10 years she had spent carrying things in silence. And she thought about the afternoon she had stood at the window and watched Ralph come down the road and made her decision. And she thought about all the complicated, stubborn, fragile, determined work of being human in a world that does not always arrange itself in the shapes you need it to. And she thought that she was not sorry for any of it. The years had been what they were, and here was where they had brought her, and here was enough. Here was more than enough. They went home, the three of them, Pauline, Ralph, and Daniel, slung over Ralph's shoulder in deep sleep, his shoes in Pauline's hand, his breath slow and even against Ralph's coat. And they put the boy to bed and moved through the quiet house together in the natural, unpracticed way of people who have always known how to be in the same space. And the house was warm and dark, except for the lamp in the kitchen and the stars outside every window. The winter came, and they moved through it together, which changed everything about winter. Not that it became easier in the physical sense. Kansas winters are what they are. And 1889 going into 1890 was cold and long. But the presence of another person, the right person, makes the confinement of winter something altogether different from what it is alone. There were long evenings by the fire with Daniel working on his schoolwork and Ralph reading the newspaper he picked up in town, and Pauline sewing. The three of them occupying the same quiet space with the easy comfort of a family that has found its shape. There were also the evenings when Daniel was in bed, and the house was very quiet, and the fire had burned down to coals, and Ralph and Pauline sat together on the settee and talked in the way they could only talk when it was just the two of them. Not about farm business or Daniel's schoolwork or what needed doing, but about everything that lay deeper, all the accumulated thoughts and hopes and half-formed beliefs that a person gathers over a life and does not always have someone to offer them to. She told him about her father and the books he had kept and lent to her in her girlhood, which was how she had learned to love reading and the particular quality of mind that came with it. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was 16, and how he had gone west at 17 with $20 and a saddle and built everything he had from those components, and what that had made him. They learned each other in the way you only learn someone when you are not rushing, when you have taken the long way around and earned the patience that comes with it. Spring came early and busy. The planting needed doing, and the cattle needed attention, and Ralph bought 3 additional head in March, which he and Pauline had agreed upon after some satisfying and spirited discussion about the farm's finances and future over several evenings in late winter, and which Daniel had strong opinions about, and was allowed to contribute to the conversation about in the respectful but clear-eyed way that Ralph had begun to involve the boy in anything that was going to be his land someday. In April, Pauline told Ralph she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, saying it straight out the way she said everything, because she had long since decided that directness was kinder than any other approach, and she watched his face and watched the exact moment the words landed, and what happened to his expression was something she knew she would remember in the same category as the other things she kept in the permanent chamber of her memory. Daniel's first breath, the feeling of rain after the long summer dry, the way the land looked on a clear October morning when the frost was still on the grass. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and took her face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that she felt in every part of herself, and then he held her close and she could feel him laughing, that warm, genuine laugh against her hair. "A baby," he said. "In October," she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. "October," he said. "A fall baby, like the wedding." "You and your October," she said, and she was laughing too, the easy, surprised laughter that kept coming back to her since Ralph had returned, and that she had decided simply to live inside. Daniel received this information with the considered thoughtfulness of a 9-going-on-10-year-old, and said he supposed it would be all right as long as the baby was not too loud for the first while, and then asked whether it would be a boy or a girl, and was told truthfully that no one knew, and absorbed this uncertainty with the philosophical acceptance of someone who has learned from his mother to deal with what is actual rather than what one wishes were actual. The spring and summer passed in the full and productive way of seasons when a farm is well managed, and the people working it are in good health and good spirits. Ralph had become, over the winter and spring, not merely a man living on Pauline's farm but a genuine partner in it, not overriding her judgments, which were good and which she had spent 15 years earning, but adding his own knowledge and labor to hers so that the whole of what they could do together was considerably larger than what either had managed alone. He was good with the cattle, naturally. It was where a decade of his life had gone, and he improved the herd systematically and without extravagance, making the kind of careful investments that take thought rather than simply money. He negotiated a better price at the cattle market in the fall than Pauline had ever managed to get from buyers who had always sensed, correctly, that she was selling without leverage. He did this pleasantly, and without anyone's feelings getting hurt, the way a man negotiates when he has confidence and time on his side. In town, the fact of Ralph's return and marriage to Pauline had settled into the community's collective consciousness in the way things do in small towns, with initial interest and then gradual, accepting familiarity. He had become a known quantity in Caldwell. The man at the Chandler farm, Pauline's husband, solid, reasonable, someone you could rely on for a straight answer and a fair deal. He joined the men's meeting at the church, and he sat on the committee that was organized that summer to deal with the drainage issue on the north end of town that flooded the main street every spring. And he went to the Grange meetings because farm country operated on collective knowledge and collective support, and he had always understood this. There was one complication, which Pauline had expected and which arrived in July. His name was Garrett Hale, and he had been, along with the late Benjamin Crowther, one of the original organizers of the Cattlemen's Association that had made things difficult for small operators in the county during the late 1870s. He was in his late 50s now, gray and prosperous, and he came to the farm on a Tuesday afternoon when Ralph was in town and Pauline was in the garden. He rode up to the fence line and stopped and said, "Mrs. Chandler, or I suppose it's Mrs. Prescott now." Pauline straightened and looked at him across the garden fence with the calm steadiness she had developed over years of managing alone. "It is," she said. "I understand your husband is the Ralph Prescott who worked for Carmichael Outfit in '79, Hale said. "He is," she said. "Well," Hale said. He was watching her with the careful look of a man who is not certain what he is walking into. "I'll say plainly that there were things done by the association back then that I'm not proud of. Crowther ran that operation with more force than was called for, and I knew it and didn't stop it." He paused. "If your husband has any unfinished business regarding that time, I'd sooner address it than leave it lying." Pauline looked at him steadily. "I'll tell him you came by," she said. "That you said what you said. The decision of what to do with it is his." When Ralph came home she told him, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What did you make of it?" "I think he meant it," she said. "Men who want to avoid trouble don't usually ride to the front gate and offer to discuss it. They stay home and hope nobody brings it up." Ralph nodded slowly. "I'll go see him," he said. He went the next morning. Pauline did not ask him what was said, and he came home in the early afternoon and put his horse up and came into the kitchen and sat at the table. "It's done," he said. He apologized. He said the association had overreached and that he had been complicit in it and that he was sorry for it. "I said I accepted that and I expected it to stay done." He looked at her. "That is all." "Is it enough?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "It does not undo what was done," he said, "but yes, it is enough." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "I am not going to spend the rest of my life in a quarrel with the past." She turned her hand over and held his. "Good," she said. "It was a small thing perhaps, and perhaps not everyone would have called it justice. But it was an accounting, offered and received, and it closed a door that had been left open for a decade, and there was something to be said for that." The baby came in October, as expected, a boy, which Pauline had suspected but not been certain of, loud and healthy and apparently very unhappy about the transition from warmth to the external world, which he expressed at considerable volume for the first several minutes, and then settled into with the pragmatic acceptance of a new person who has concluded that the situation, while not what he would have chosen, is workable. Ralph was there, because Pauline had asked him to be, and because the thought of being anywhere else had not seriously occurred to him. He sat with her through the long labor, holding her hand when she needed holding, stepping back when she needed space, fetching what was needed, and keeping Daniel occupied with a combination of reassurance and distraction that showed a genuine understanding of the particular anxiety of a 10-year-old boy whose mother is going through something he cannot fix and cannot fully comprehend. When the baby was born and Pauline lay back against the pillows with the cleaned and bundled infant on her chest, Ralph sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them both with an expression that was entirely insufficient for language to carry, which is the only honest way to describe it. "A boy," Pauline said. Her voice was tired and full of light. "A boy," Ralph said. "I want to name him James," she said. "After your father, if that is all right." He looked at her. There was something in his eyes that she had not seen before, or perhaps she had seen it but not quite in this form, something raw and undefended and absolutely real. "James," he said. "Yes, that is more than all right." Daniel came in and looked at his new brother with the wary, assessing look he brought to significant new information, and then he said, "He is very small," with the tone of a person noting a possibly correctable deficiency. "He will get bigger," Ralph said. "I know that," Daniel said with the dignity of someone who has read enough to understand the concept of growth. He studied the infant further. "He looks like you," he said to Ralph. Ralph looked at the baby and then at Pauline, who was smiling with her eyes closed. "I suppose he does, a little," Ralph said. "I think that is fine," Daniel said, apparently concluding the official assessment, and went to find the barn cat, which had apparently been forgiven for all past transgressions. The year turned from 1889 into 1890, and the Prescott farm for it was called that now in the county records, having been redeeded under their joint names on the occasion of the marriage, continued to grow and improve. The cattle herd was up to 23 head by the following spring, and Pauline had expanded the kitchen garden into a proper vegetable plot that she was beginning to sell from at the Saturday market in Caldwell, which brought in money, and which she found she enjoyed for the social element as much as the economic one. Daniel turned 10 and then 11, and was becoming someone you could see the shape of a boy who read everything he could find and asked questions with an almost aggressive curiosity, and who was developing, under Ralph's steady and unforced influence, a genuine facility with horses and cattle that Ralph recognized and nurtured with the patience of a man who understands that skill cannot be rushed, only guided. Ralph and Pauline had the ordinary arguments of people who are genuinely partners, over money sometimes, over what to plant where, once over a fence line that was actually not their fence line at all, but a misunderstanding about the county survey that was resolved when they both looked at the map and realized they were both correct in different ways, which they each found funnier than the argument itself had been. They had these arguments and resolved them and went on, and what they resolved into each time was something more solid and more known. The way stone is not weakened by being repeatedly struck, but slowly shaped into something more defined. James grew as Daniel had predicted, trading the initial outrage of infancy for the sunny, determined personality that Pauline recognized early, and that Ralph said reminded him of her, which she accepted as the compliment it was intended to be. He was a cheerful, indomitable baby who decided to walk at 10 months, and fell down so many times in the process that Pauline stopped counting and simply placed cushions strategically and let him at it. And by 11 months, he was walking with the pleased, slightly wobbling confidence of a person who has conquered something and knows it. In the summer of 1891, when James was walking and talking in the abbreviated but determined way of children his age, and Daniel was 12, and had declared his intention to be either a cattleman or a lawyer, and Ralph had said these were not mutually exclusive, Pauline found herself standing at the kitchen window one evening in the quiet after supper, watching Ralph and Daniel in the yard. They were working on something with a piece of rope, some knot that Daniel was trying to master, and Ralph was demonstrating with the easy patience that characterized everything he did with the boy. The last of the day's light was on them, amber and low, and James was on a blanket on the porch behind her making commentary to his bare feet, and the house was warm at her back, and the air smelled of supper and dry grass and the first hint of the evening's cool. She stood there and felt the full weight and texture of the life she had built, and the life that had been given to her, and the life that she and Ralph had made together out of everything that had come before and everything that was still coming. She felt the 10 years of silence and what they had cost her and what carrying them had taught her. That truth, however long delayed, has a way of finding its moment, and that when it does, it can become not just an ending but a beginning. She felt the specific, irreplaceable reality of the two people in the yard and the child on the porch, and the farm around them with its particular smell and color and feel, and the wide Kansas sky above it going from blue to purple to the first, tentative appearance of stars. Ralph looked up from the rope and saw her at the window, and he smiled, the full smile, not the suggestion of one, and she smiled back, and the distance between the window and the yard was not very far at all. She went out to them, stepping off the porch and scooping James as she passed, settling him on her hip and walking across the yard toward the two of them in the fading light. And Daniel looked up from his knot and said without looking away from it, "I almost have it," with intense concentration. And Ralph said, "Keep the end through before you pull." And Pauline stood beside her husband and watched her older son master the knot and held her younger son on her hip and listened to the evening prairie singing its long, low note all around them. "There," Daniel said, and held up the rope, the knot perfectly formed. "Good man," Ralph said, and Daniel tried not to look too pleased about this and failed, grinning in the way that made him look about 6 years old. And Ralph put his hand on the boy's shoulder for a moment before Daniel ran off toward the barn to show the knot to whoever would look at it, which would be the horses and possibly the barn cat. Ralph turned to Pauline and took James from her, settling the boy against his shoulder with the natural confidence of a man who had been doing it for more than a year and had found he was better at it than he expected, and James grabbed a fistful of Ralph's shirt and held on, satisfied. "Good evening," Ralph said. "Good evening," she said. They walked back toward the house together in the falling dark. The lamp was still burning in the kitchen window, a steady warm square of light, and above them the stars were coming out one by one, the way they do over open country, unhurried, inevitable, each one appearing as though it had always been there and was simply now making itself visible. She reached for his free hand and took it, and he held hers, and they walked across the yard toward the light. The years that followed were good years, full years, the kind that ask a great deal of you and give back proportionally. The farm continued to grow and prosper in the modest, solid way of a well-run operation that does not gamble on speculation, but builds steadily on what it knows. Ralph became one of the recognized cattlemen of the county, not the largest, not the wealthiest, but reliable and respected, a man whose word at the market was known to be good and whose fence lines were always right. Pauline's Saturday market grew into a small but consistent business that she ran with the brisk competence she brought to everything, and she gained a reputation in town for the quality of her preserves and the honesty of her measures, which was the kind of reputation she preferred. Daniel grew into the young man you could see the outline of when he was 12. At 15, he was reading law books borrowed from Judge Harlan, who had taken a shine to him, and who lent freely from his library with the attitude of a man who believes in the promiscuous distribution of education. At 16, he was corresponding with a law office in Wichita that had advertised for a clerk, and Ralph helped him write the letter and Pauline reviewed it for clarity, and they sent it off and waited with the compressed, cautious hopefulness of a family that has learned not to want things too loudly in case the wanting spooks them. The letter came back positive. Daniel would go to Wichita at 17 to read law under the supervision of a firm that had been practicing in Kansas for 15 years, and he would do it well, and Pauline knew this with the certainty that mothers know things about their children that no amount of evidence is needed to confirm. But that was still in the future. On the evening when the whole family was at supper, James at 3 now, speaking in the full paragraphs of a child who has apparently decided there is a great deal to say and no reason to delay saying it, and Daniel at 14 and thoughtful, and Ralph at Pauline's right hand where he had been for these years since October of 1889, and Ralph looked across the table at her in the lamplight, and she looked back at him. And they had that particular exchange that has no words, the one that passes between two people who know each other well enough to speak without speaking. What it said was approximately this: Look at this. Look at what we have made. And I know. And I did not always believe it was possible to have this. And she had thought, more times than she could count in the years since she had opened her mouth and told Ralph Prescott everything, that she was glad she had told him. Not just for the love that had come from it, not just for the life they had built, but for the specific relief of it. The laying down of a burden she had carried for so long that she had stopped noticing its weight until the moment it was gone. And then the absence of it was so vast and clean that she had stood in her own kitchen and simply breathed. There are things we carry in silence because we believe we must, and sometimes that belief is correct and the silence is mercy. But sometimes the silence becomes its own kind of stone, and the bearing of it begins to wear us in ways that are not visible from outside. Pauline had carried her stone for 10 years, and she had believed she was carrying it for good reasons, and perhaps she was, and it did not matter now. What mattered was that she had set it down. She had told him everything, and he had stayed. She woke sometimes, in the deep quiet of 3 in the morning when the house was utterly still, and the only sounds were the breathing of the night outside and the soft, steady sound of Ralph sleeping beside her. And she lay still in the dark, and felt the full particular reality of her life around her, the warmth of the bed, and the weight of the man beside her, and James sleeping in his room across the hall and Daniel in his, and the farm outside the walls. The land she had tended for 15 years, and that had tended her in return in the way land does when you commit to it fully, and the stars above all of it, indifferent and magnificent. She lay still and she thought about the 20-year-old woman she had been, going to her marriage with her eyes open about necessity and closed about love, and the silence she had gathered around herself across the decade that followed, and the Thursday afternoon in the summer of 1889, when a man had come down a dusty road and she had watched him from the window and known that the time for silence was over. She did not regret the telling, not the smallest particle of it. She turned toward Ralph in the dark and put her hand on his chest, feeling the slow rise and fall of his breathing, the warmth of him, the real and present aliveness of him beside her. He stirred. He was not quite asleep. "I'm here," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "I just wanted to make sure." He put his arm around her and pulled her close, and she settled against him, and the house was quiet and the stars were in their places and the land lay all around them steady as it had always been, and Pauline Chandler Prescott closed her eyes and slept without dreaming, which is to say, she slept the deep and dreamless sleep of a woman who has nothing left that needs to be said. In the spring of 1892, she and Ralph stood at the north fence of the farm on a Sunday morning in April, and looked out over the pasture, where the new grass was coming in green and insistent through the brown winter mat, and the cattle were scattered across it in the peaceful, purposeful way of cattle who have found good grazing, and have no particular concern beyond the next mouthful. The sky was pale blue and enormous, and the air was full of the smell of the new season, wet earth and grass, and something indefinable that Pauline associated only and always with spring on the Kansas prairie. "I want to put more land in next year," Ralph said. "The tract on the east side. Harmon's boy is selling since his father died, and it is good grazing land." "It is good land," Pauline agreed. "We can talk to the bank about the note." "Henderson at the First Bank is amenable," Ralph said. "I spoke to him last week." She looked at him. "You spoke to him before talking to me." He looked back at her with the honest directness that was simply the way he was. "I wanted to know whether it was possible before I proposed it," he said. "If it wasn't possible, I didn't see the point in discussing it. If it is, which it appears to be, then it is your decision as much as mine." She considered this for a moment and decided it was reasonable. "All right," she said. "But next time tell me you are going to talk to Henderson." "Agreed," he said. She turned back to the pasture. "I think we should do it," she said. "The Harmon tract. It would round out the south end properly and give us room to increase the herd without overgrazing the current pasture." "That's what I thought," he said. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out over the land. James came running from the direction of the house, having escaped from whatever occupation Pauline had left him with, and flung himself at Ralph's legs and announced, in the comprehensive fashion of a 22-month-old with strong views, that he wanted to see the cows. Ralph picked him up and settled him against his chest. "Those are cattle," he said, because this was apparently an important distinction that Ralph had decided James should learn early. "Cows," James said confidently. "Cattle," Ralph said. James looked at him with great serenity. "Cows," he said again. Pauline laughed and Ralph gave her a long-suffering look over the boy's head that was entirely undermined by the fact that he was smiling. "Cattle," James said suddenly, as though the word had just found its way to the right part of his mind. He said it again, testing it. "Cattle." "There," Ralph said. "That is correct." "He's going to be insufferably pleased with himself about that," Pauline said. "Probably," Ralph agreed. "He gets that from you." She took Ralph's free arm and they stood together in the spring morning with the land stretching out before them and behind them and around them on every side. And James said, "Cattle," several more times with increasing satisfaction, and the farm was alive and warm in the April sunlight. And Pauline thought, as she had thought many times, in many forms, across the years since she had opened the truth of 10 years, and laid it on a kitchen table for a man in a dusty hat, that love, when it finally arrives in its full form, is nothing like what you imagined when you were 20 and terrified and making the best of what you had. It is quieter than you expected and more solid, and it lives in the smallest and most ordinary moments, and it asks of you only what you already have to give, and it gives back everything in return. She pressed her shoulder against Ralph's arm just briefly, just to feel the solid fact of him there, and he pressed back, and that was enough. That was the whole of it. That was the life they had made out of 10 years of silence and 1 afternoon of truth, and it was more than she had ever allowed herself to ask for, and it was entirely, completely, permanently hers.